I think that the point you're making, which is that whiteness is mediated by these other identities, speaks to that issue of, rugged individualism and how we live as individuals making our way in the world with this notion, that if we just work hard, everything will be fine, and we all have these struggles. And so a person who is white but is also a woman, or white but working class, or white but LGBT, or white but disabled, right, would be able to maybe argue, well, I've faced struggle, and they would not be lying in that. I mean, that would be very accurate. But the fact that your identity is mediated as a white person by other things doesn't mean that there isn't white privilege or advantage that attaches. It may be different than mine. Like, I'm white, I'm male, I'm straight, I'm cisgendered, I'm able-bodied. So I've got a lot of those privileged identities. Now, I'm Jewish, grew up in Nashville, so there's that. It's a little complicated. But for the most part, like, all my identities are pretty dominant. And that's definitely different than someone who grew up. Of course, you talk about white privilege with most white folks and they get defensive and all of a sudden they're all from Appalachia. You ever notice that? Like, well, I grew up in a coal mining town. No, you didn't. Like, most of the people who say that are lying. It's like when people say they have black friends, they're usually lying. Same thing when they say that they're from Appalachia. But no doubt white folks have struggled. I mean, I grew up in an 850 square foot apartment from the day that I was 3 days old, came back from the hospital, to the day I walked out the door to go to college. We didn't have any money. If this government had a more honest definition of the poverty line, my family would have been considered poor. But I still had advantage in the way that I was treated in school. Still had advantage in the presumptions of my competence. Like, I had to work really hard to prove what a bad student I was. Like, I was a really crappy student. Like, until about, 4 o'clock today, I was a really bad student. And then I got it together like a couple hours ago. We were talking, I'm like, I'm good now, But I had to work to prove that I didn't know what I was talking about because I was presumed to be competent. That's privilege in spite of lack of money. I was treated differently by cops, who would roll up on our house parties in high school, kids drinking underage, smoking weed. The cops knew it, and they would tell us to turn down our music. And then they'd roll out, and nobody went to jail, and that's privilege. So it isn't that individual initiative doesn't matter. It isn't that those things don't get in the way sometimes, and folks struggle, and we all have struggles. I'm the child of an alcoholic and an addict, and so I've faced a lot of dysfunction. But there was still that thing, and I think sometimes we think that the mediation of the identity somehow negates the reality of the privilege, but that would be absurd, right? You think about, like, people with disabilities. There are people with disabilities who are rich, right? There are people with disabilities got money in the bank, maybe more money than you and I got in the bank. That doesn't change the fact that, generally speaking, being able-bodied sort of gives you an advantage, right? There are rich people who are miserable human beings, who have horrible relationships with their kids, who might be unhealthy, even if they can pay for health care. They might have, they might have cancer, they might have horrible health issues. That doesn't change the fact that, generally speaking, having money gives you an advantage, right? It doesn't take away. I mean, sometimes exceptions to the rule prove the rule, right? It's like, we know smoking really does cause cancer. That's not just some scare theory. That's real. And yet, you may have an Aunt Polly who has smoked for 70 years and doesn't even cough. That doesn't disprove the relationship between smoking and cancer. Good for Polly, but it means nothing in a social science sense. It's like, you can get shot in the head and not die, but guess what, Cupcake? If you get shot in the head, you're pretty likely to die. There's a really high correlation. So I'm just saying, sometimes it's about thinking these things through as social phenomena. And instead, what we do is we get caught up in the discussion about this being about individuals. So it's like, well, I'm not a racist, right? We're not talking about individual bad people, good people when we talk about racism. And when we talk about privilege, we're not talking about rich people and everybody else. We're talking about the day-to-day relative advantages of having one identity versus another. And that's real. And, the analogy I use is, like, to me, white folks were sort of like snowflakes, right? Here's what I mean by that. Like, all snowflakes are different. That's what they tell us. I don't know how they know that, by the way, but apparently they do. Apparently they've looked at every snowflake and we know they're all different. But here's the thing, even if we assume that all snowflakes are different, we know a snowflake when we see a snowflake, do we not? And in the seeing of the snowflake, we can generally make some assumptions about its life trajectory and not be too far from the mark. Like, we're gonna maybe be a little off, like, how did it drift and what exactly did it crystallize? But generally, I see the snowflake, I know a little something about its life, I make an assumption, And I'm not going to be totally right because that snowflake might have had a working class background. I don't know. But generally speaking, I will know that it's a snowflake. I can make an assumption, and I'll probably be pretty close in terms of what it means. Right?
So one of the other things with that question is about the accumulation of wealth over time. So this is one of the places that a lot of white people get stuck in thinking about how it is that whiteness confers benefit, right? So there's been a fair amount that has been written about how it is that over time, through U.S. history, whiteness became conflated with freedom, right? And blackness became sort of paradigmatic of the enslaved condition. And then as we move through time, then because whiteness was conflated with freedom, it meant that people in particular bodies, white bodies, had opportunities to buy stuff, to own things, including other people, in the way that black people did not, right? And over time, that adds up. So if Tim sort of talked a little bit about his history, but if you can imagine someone, I can't even think of a good example, buying a house, some house that you bought in 1950 or 40 or 30, let's go back, 30, and that house was worth $3,000 when you bought it, right? In a neighborhood that the US government made sure that people of color could not also purchase in. And there were a lot of policies about this. Many people don't know that this is part of our history. Or many white people don't know that this is part of our history. And so you buy this house for $3,000, and over time, so like you buy that in 1930 and it goes through generations, and so today that house is worth $1.5 million, right? Let's suppose it's in New York someplace. And then think of the accumulation of wealth over all that time. Now, the same, or if we think of a black family, right, who was not allowed to buy in that same neighborhood. The neighborhood that family was allowed to buy in is a less desirable neighborhood. The house still costs the same, or we could even imagine that the house costs more, $5,000 in 1940 now. So it costs $5,000 in a less desirable neighborhood, and now today it's not even there because the neighborhood got destroyed to put a freeway through there. There's no accumulation of wealth over time, and nothing for people to inherit over time, right? So no sort of borrowing against the house to go to college, no using the equity from the house to do anything. And all of that goes through time.
Right.
So when people say stuff like, well, my family worked really hard too, of course they did. They all did. But the benefits of the work are different, depending on how you are positioned by race. It is not always the case that because people of color have less assets or have less money or whatever, that they work less, although that's the narrative we tell ourselves, because to tell ourselves anything different is to say the whole system is unfair. And that's no good. We don't want to do that. Right. Because then it would mean that if I'm white, I'm unfairly advantaged. And what does that mean, right? Unfairly advantaged. If I'm white, it might mean that I'm not as good as I thought, I'm not working as hard as I thought, that things are happening, right? And it's not only because of my effort. And that's really tough to wrap your brain around. If you've always been taught you can do whatever you do and everything you accomplish is due to your effort.
And yet what's fascinating about that mentality that it's all about me and my effort is itself part and parcel of a privileged mindset, because people from marginalized groups have always known it was a collective effort just to keep them alive, let alone to actually thrive. So for people of color, for poor white folks for that matter, who are still poor, they know that the idea that it's all about them and their individual initiative, that's something you only have the luxury of believing if you've had a certain degree of privilege and advantage where you've actually seen that work. If you haven't seen that work, you know that that's not real. And you know, the example that you brought up about accumulated wealth, I mean, this is actually my family's story. I mean, my grandfather bought a house in 1950, the first house that my mom lived in that was an owned home as opposed to rented. Bought it in 1950. He'd been in the military, and then he was a civil servant in Corps of Engineers. So this was not a get-rich kind of job. It was a government job, but it was paid okay, had good benefits, and it was a kind of job that people of color at that time really couldn't have gotten within civil service. He buys this house in 1950, pays off the note in 15 years, buys another house with cash, pays off that note in several years, buys another house with cash, pays that note off in several years, buys another house with cash, dies in 1980. I go to college in 1986 because my grandmother is able to take her house and use that as collateral against the loan I needed to get to pay my tuition bill because we didn't have any money. I told you, we lived in an apartment. We didn't have any dough. We didn't have any collateral, but we had that house, which was a house that was the fifth house they'd owned, paid for with cash, all tracing back to the first house, which they could only buy because they were white. They couldn't have bought that house in that neighborhood otherwise. So I'm literally going to college, 36 years after the fact on the basis of that. And right now, just to put this in some perspective, nationally, the 400 richest white people in this country have the same net worth, $2.3 trillion, the same net worth as all 40 million African Americans combined. Let me repeat. 400 white people have the same collective net worth as all black folks in the United States combined. Now, there are only two ways that you can interpret that. Number one, there are 400 white people who were just that damn smart and worked that much harder than 40 million black people combined. And if you believe that, can't do nothing for you. Like, if you're a student, disenroll. You're wasting time and money. You're wasting either your parents' money or my money as a taxpayer paying for your education. Just quit. Just drop out. Do something else. Like, you cannot be saved. Or the other possible interpretation is something else is going on, and it's this thing to which you're speaking, which is that some folks had advantages and opportunities that other folks didn't have. And some of that was about race, some of that was about economic advantage, some of that was about being men, some of it was all three of those things, whatever. But it had nothing to do with merit. And the quicker we get used to being able to tell our own story, like, I'm not ashamed about the fact that I went to college on that house. I just think that everybody should have had the opportunity to do that. I'm not beating myself up about it. It wasn't my fault. I was born into that, but I need to own that. Because if I can't own that and I start thinking that it's all about me, and then my children come to think, I got a 14 and a 12-year-old, and they start thinking, well, we've worked really hard. You're 14. You hadn't done a damn thing. You hadn't done anything. You graduated lower school. You're about to graduate middle school. Congratulations. That was hard. I mean, it's like, at best, I worked hard, and hell, I didn't even really work hard. I got stuff handed to me. So let's just own our stuff. And then we can have an honest conversation about how to create opportunity for everybody.